And thank you for joining us for Understanding Managed Services Organization. I appreciate the introduction. Let me tell you just a little bit more about myself. I have been in the industry for about 20 years. I came in at Perkins Coie, so I was at a thousand attorney law firm for 10 years in progressive roles. I was then chief financial officer at a 350, almost 400 attorney law firm for 5 years. Involved in a lot of finance technology implementations at those firms, which gave me an opportunity to touch everyone's stuff and understand how data flows through the organization. I was lured away from big law by a private equity company that had purchased the back office of a 150 attorney firm. So this was Ramon Law and what was called Nova Law at the time. It is now called Briefly, which is one of the very first private equity-backed managed services organizations in legal. So very exciting to be part of that kind of emerging function before anyone knew what MSOs were or how to use those words. And I formed Federate with my co-founder about 2 years ago, according to LinkedIn. Federate provides managed services to small to mid-sized firms. So our sweet spot is really for brand new firms where the lawyers want to own their own firm, but they don't want to think about any of the business aspects of it. So they outsource all of that back office to us, and so they can focus on their practice and building their firm. I also spend quite a bit of my time doing strategic advisory work with firms of all sizes, from 1,000 attorneys to four attorneys. And a lot of that activity lately has been around managed services organization. And so I am excited to be able to tell you about why I think this is such a powerful tool that's emerging in the industry for law firms to really increase the flexibility and opportunities for them to take advantage of the business aspects of the law firm. But before we do that, let's talk about law firms. So, law firms are special, and I know that we all know that, and it's not just because it's filled with lawyers, though that is certainly part of it. Law firms are special because they don't operate like most other businesses. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing, but it is how it's designed. The structure of law firms is really shaped by professional and regulatory constraints, particularly around ownership. What this means is that non-lawyers, which is how it's defined in the ABA, can't own law firms. And that makes law firms structurally different from many, many other industries and organizations. And that has some pretty broad implications about the management of the law firm. It means that most law firms operate as partnerships. And as that, the profits are distributed to the partners rather than retained and reinvested in the company. So capital doesn't accumulate. You don't have retained earnings in the same way in law firms that you would in a corporation or a business in another industry. It means that capital doesn't accumulate in the business over time. It also means that decision making within a law firm is frequently decentralized. So, in a traditional corporate hierarchy, you've got a CEO where the buck proverbially stops. Whereas in a law firm, authority sits with the partners and with practice groups, and not necessarily a centralized leadership model, which has big implications on how decisions are made and how long it takes to get decisions made in a law firm. It also means the structure means that revenue is tied directly to the people who are doing the work. So the focus always stays on the billable activity instead of building infrastructure within the organization. So the result is that while law firms can and are highly successful, they're structurally constrained when it comes to things around scaling and standardizing, investing the same way that other businesses would. And the reality that we're living in right now is that while that structure has worked for a long time, the world is changing. The amount of business pressures that we are experiencing as law firms are becoming more complex and more intense at the same time. The environment along the law firms has changed faster than the law firm model. And that's where we're really seeing the pressure start to build. Clients are more demanding than they've ever been. They expect efficiency and transparency and consistency across matters and across offices. And at the same time, the cost of running the business is increasing. The cost of technology and managing the ever-growing amount of data that we're all managing, security and cybersecurity, and then talent management. These aren't optional anymore, and they're not cheap. And at the same time, things are getting more complex. You've got more offices, you've got a wider practice group structure, you've got more systems and more technology, and not always more coordination. In addition to that, you've got some additional competition in the industry. It says because it's not just other law firms that we're competing with anymore. There's alternative service providers and technology companies that are moving into this space that are built very differently and have very different incentive and ownership structures than law firms. And our model really wasn't built for this. Our model was built for independent practices and high autonomy of partners and the focus on delivering legal expertise. It wasn't built for continuous infrastructure investment or standardization across the firm or centralized operating decisions and scalable systems. So when firms try to do these things internally, they hit friction because it's not that they're doing anything wrong, it's just that that's not how the model was built, and we're pushing against the design limits of this traditional law firm model. And that's where MSOs come in. So a managed services organization provides additional options for that law firm. At a basic level, it creates a dedicated structure for business operations. And having that separate structure supports more sustained investment in that infrastructure and centralizing capabilities. It's not about replacing the law firm or changing the law firm. It's about changing the structure around the business aspects of the law and making the business aspects capable of keeping up with the demands that the law firm is experiencing. So what is an MSO? At its simplest, an MSO, managed services organization, is a separate entity that provides business services to the firm. So things like finance, billing, IT, HR, operations, not legal work. The difference is structural. Those functions aren't embedded in the partnership anymore. They're centralized in an entity designed to operate consistently and scale with a formal defined agreement with the firm about what those services are and how they'll be delivered. So it is a separation of the business operations from the legal work through the use of a separate entity. So what's the difference between this and a shared services platform? Like a lot of firms have shared services, finance, IT, HR are centralized across offices, and that's a great step. But it's still in the same operating structure as the law firm. So you're still facing a lot of those structural issues around decision making and structure. Whereas you can get a lot of efficiency with a shared services model, but they're designed to coordinate work and reduce duplication. An MSO is different. An MSO creates a separate operating structure, and it doesn't just consolidate the work. It does a lot of the same things that you would do in a shared services platform, but it changes how that work is governed and funded and managed. In a shared services model, those functions are still subject to the same partnership dynamics, the same funding constraints, the same decision-making challenges. In an MSO, those functions sit in a structure that's designed to operate more like a business, a separate business, and more centralized accountability. So you've got more consistent investment, more ability to scale. So the difference is not just organizational, it's structural. Shared services improve how the firm runs, and MSO takes that to the next level and changes how the business side is actually built. So there are, of course, a lot of things that can be done within a firm that does not require an MSO, but an MSO takes this to the next level. So you may be thinking, I can do all of this already in my firm. And to be fair, that's true. Firms can improve operations internally, and we certainly do. You can centralize functions, you can standardize processes, you can invest in better systems, you can hire strong leadership, and you can make a lot of progress there. It's not about capability, it's about sustainability and about structure. There are a few areas where firms consistently struggle to go further. One is constant reinvestment, which is what we need in this day and age, especially when it comes to technology. Most firms are still built around annual profit distribution. So sustained multi-year, multi-planned investment in infrastructure can be very challenging in that environment when the intent is to distribute as much to the partners as possible. And it's hard to align your non-lawyer leadership with long-term outcomes when they don't have an ownership interest in that. They are always going to be staff, whereas in other industries, the kind of industries that we're competing with for top-level talent, there is the opportunity for them to have ownership interest and then all of those interests be aligned in the success of the organization. In a traditional firm, the business side is always going to be influenced by the partnership model, which makes it harder to run operations with independence and consistency. So the distinction isn't can this be done? It's can it be done consistently and at scale and over time within a partnership model? And that's where an MSO structure can really make a big difference. So one of the less discussed, but honestly more important aspects of this is really around ownership and continuity. One of the practical differences between a traditional law firm model and an MSO is that in a traditional law firm model, ownership is tied to active partners, which means over time, ownership is constantly changing. Partners join, retire, leave, and when they do, they give up their ownership interest. And that creates a natural turnover in who owns the business. It affects continuity. It affects how long-term decisions are made. It affects how investments are prioritized, and it affects how stable the leadership structure really is over time. An MSO has an opportunity to be different. Ownership isn't tied to practicing status in the same way, and it can include non-lawyer leadership. It can persist beyond someone's active role in the law firm. You get a different kind of continuity, more stability in ownership, more alignment for the people actually running operations, and more ability to think in longer time horizons. This doesn't change how the legal practice is owned, but it does change how the business side can be built and sustained and aligns more with how other industries have approached building and scaling and the ownership of businesses. I'm working with a large law firm right now, and one of the challenges that the partners have identified is that they have put a lot of time and effort and energy into building this law firm. And once they retire, they have to completely surrender their ownership. Whereas by having an MSO model, they don't have to do that when they retire. They can still retain interest in the ongoing organization even after they stop practicing. So it just, again, it opens up opportunities that are not available under the current partnership model. Okay, you've probably heard a lot of news around non-lawyer ownership of law firms in various states. Arizona has gotten a lot of press around their alternative business structure program, or ABS structure. And it's one of the things I want you to take away from this is that an MSO is not an ABS. An ABS has gotten a lot of big press, and so a lot of the conversation around non-lawyer ownership is around that ABS model. And they get mixed up all the time with MSOs, but they are fundamentally different. An MSO is a separate entity that sits alongside the law firm. It handles the business side, but it does not practice law. It works within the existing ownership rules dictated by the American Bar Association. An ABS is different. It allows non-lawyers to own or have a stake in the entity that actually delivers the legal services. That's a regulatory shift, and it's only allowed in certain jurisdictions in certain states. Some states have pushed back really hard on this, like California. So the distinction is very important. ABS and MSOs can exist in the same ecosystem. What we're seeing a lot for people that have moved into the ABS model is that they are also establishing MSOs to manage the business aspects of that ABS. But an ABS is a law firm that provides legal services but has non-lawyer ownership. An MSO does not provide legal services. And so what we're seeing right now is a lot of the excitement and activity around ABSs that we've seen over the last couple of years is starting to die down. And the attention is being shifted to MSOs because they're a more practical approach with fewer regulatory issues. And so it's really important for you to understand that these are two fundamentally different things. And ABS changes who can own and control the practice of law, where MSOs reorganize how the business of law is run. You also have some options in what the models can look like under a managed services organization. There's no one single way to do that. A single firm MSO is exactly what it sounds like. One firm creates an MSO, a separate organization, to centralize and manage its own operations more effectively, with the intent that that MSO will never support any other law firms, just this one firm and maybe some of its associated entities. A multi-firm model is spreads those capabilities over several firms. So this is what Federate, my company, does. We have an MSO that supports multiple firms through one managed services organization. You can see more scale. So we have the opportunity to provide some economies of scale and access to resources that small firms wouldn't be able to realize on their own or potentially afford on their own through a shared model, with the intent that there's no cross-pollination of data. Everybody's got their own separate thing, but there are resources that we can share and scale. A PE-backed model starts introducing external capital, and we're going to talk about that a lot more in a minute. The external capital can really help fund some of the growth rather than having it being drawn from the partners, as our typical model is. And then there's, some mix of the two, where you may have some external investment, and it could be a shared model, but there's a variety of ways to approach this and a number of different moving parts, depending on the specific needs of the firm. Most firms will start pretty simple, and we will start seeing some growth in the complexity, but for the most part, what we're seeing is a lot of single firm MSOs being discussed. So MSOs have kind of become synonymous with private equity because that's the vehicle that PE is using to invest in this industry. And while it might have been their idea, you don't really need PE to get the benefits out of the managed services model. So we're going to dig into that a lot more now. So capital is restricted in a law firm. The capital contributions in a law firm is limited to that firm's practicing attorneys. And the legal industry has historically limited outside ownership for good reasons. I mean, the goal has been to protect independence and professional judgment and client interests. So ownership is tied to licensing attorneys. Non-lawyer involvement is by definition restricted. In the partnership model reinforces internal control over how firms operate with the idea of maintaining that independence and professional judgment and client interests. And those constraints have shaped this industry for a long time, but they also limit how capital flows into the business side of firms. And historically, that wasn't that big a deal because the capital needs of these law firms were relatively limited because we were largely service organizations. That's not really true anymore. Our need for investment has grown and continues to grow, and the model has become kind of a problem. When your goal is to distribute as much profit as possible to your partners, you're not retaining and reinvesting that you would see in other industries. We don't have the same conversations around return on investment in law firms because the growth is funded by the partners, which means there's a very real perception that any infrastructure improvement or software and development that you want to do is coming out of the personal wallets of those partners, which makes budget conversations super fun and long-term planning really challenging because you are competing with individual interest on how they want to manage their money. At the same time, the day-to-day costs of running the firm are also increasing. So there is a continuous pressure on how to maintain that profitability. And you have a mismatch. The expenses and the need for investment are going up, but the structure limits how that investment happens. And the tension really is why firms are considering alternative models, and private equity firms are eager to have those conversations. So what is private equity? Private equity is capital that's deployed to acquire and grow businesses. So this is outside investors from the legal industry, non-lawyers for the most part, that are investing in companies throughout the world to improve operations and scale them and eventually have an exit or a liquidity event where they make money off of building that company. And this is usually within a defined time frame, like a 3 to 5, 7-year time frame. And since private equity can't invest in the practice of law itself outside of Arizona and certain jurisdictions that have allowed that ABS model, it's interested in investing in the business side, which is where the MSOs come in. Operations, infrastructure, technology, and platforms that support how legal services are delivered are very appealing to PE right now. And that distinction matters because it's what makes the MSO structure relevant to private equity and where a lot of these conversations are coming from right now. So why is PE interested in us? Well, the legal industry is one of the last great frontiers for private equity because we've had all of these regulatory restrictions around ownership. It's also a highly fragmented market. We have thousands of firms, many of whom are building the same infrastructure independently over and over again. And if we're honest with ourselves, there's some clear operational inefficiencies. Billing and collections, IT, data management, areas where performance vary widely across firms, and a lot of improvement is possible. There's also a significant amount of spend within the legal industry on non-legal functions, but that spend isn't necessarily optimized or centralized. And much of the work that those business operations do are recurring and routine, like billing cycles and onboarding and support functions, these things that are ongoing operational needs that are ripe for optimization. When you put that all together, it starts to look less like a traditional law firm problem and more like a platform opportunity to private equity. And that's what's getting a lot of attention right now. So when PE looks at our industry, they see it differently from the way that law firms have and the way that a lot of us insiders have looked at it traditionally. So where law firms see support functions in IT and HR and finance, PE sees a scalable platform. Where firms see variability and the need for customization and for every firm to be a special snowflake, PE sees an opportunity to create standardization and to optimize functions. And where firms focus on legal work as the core value, and the business layer kind of is a supporting function, PE looks at this as a operational layer. Data infrastructure, they're not trying to really necessarily improve legal judgment. They're looking to at how the business runs and how to make it more consistent and scalable and efficient. The difference in perspective there is really important because PE is looking at our operations in a completely different way than law firms have historically. And it's what's driving a lot of activity and interest. So what does PE bring into the table? At a very practical level, cash. They're bringing money, which means that you can get outside investment from private equity to invest in things like infrastructure and technology and talent that without having to take it out of the pockets of your partners. Or depending on the deal, it can be a payout to the partners for how they want to structure these deals. Every one of these deals is different at this point. But it does allow for investment that a lot of firms have struggled to invest in. And it brings a different operating model. So what PE also offers is playbooks around management and operations to create some centralized, clear accountability and faster decision making when it comes to some things. And then there's an ability potentially to scale across multiple firms, which is where you really start to see the leverage in shared infrastructure. So the benefit isn't just around funding, it can be around speed and discipline and the ability to build capabilities that most firms struggle to develop on their own. But it doesn't come without trade-offs. So there is a risk absolutely associated with taking outside capital, particularly in this industry that has such regulatory restrictions around outside engagement in the practice of law. And outside capital is not neutral. They are coming with expectations. They are spending money to make money. So they have financial returns and timelines and a focus on performance that as an industry we are not generally accustomed to, particularly on the business side. This can create a lot of tension within a law firm environment. In law firms, decisions have traditionally been driven by partners and long-term relationships, whereas in private equity, the decision making is driven on profitability and efficiency. So there can be a lot of tension there, which can be a major cultural issue. There can be a loss of control. You don't get that partner that gets the special thing that they always want all the time because you are looking to standardize and create consistency in the structure in order to create that efficiency. And so it shifts how some of those decisions are made and who has influence over what. And culturally, this can be a really big shift. Not every firm is built to operate in that kind of environment. And then, of course, there's also outside perception. Clients have views on how outside investment affects the independence and priorities of the law firm. So while capital can accelerate growth and capability, it also challenges the dynamics of how firms operate and their perception within the market. So all these things have to be balanced as you're looking at any kind of outside capital. So, do you need PE in order to benefit from a managed services organization? No, no, you don't. Um, Firms can get real value from an MSO simply by changing how the operations are structured and managed and taking advantage of that outside structure. You can centralize, you can get better billing discipline, you can get stronger technology decisions, more consistent execution. Those benefits don't require outside capital. Private equity can accelerate things and it can allow for a faster investment and broader scale, but the core value of an MSO comes from structure, not from funding. So this isn't an all or nothing decision. Firms can move in this direction without committing to outside capital. And we are seeing more and more interest in that right now because there are so many additional benefits and flexibility that come with this model, even if there is no interest in outside capital. So, if you are looking at an MSO, should you consider outside investment? Um, and it's not about whether it's good or bad, it's about fit. So, there are situations where firms start to look at outside investment more seriously. Usually, it's when the level of investment exceeds what the partnership model can comfortably support, or when speed starts to matter. So if you're trying to build infrastructure, scale operations, or expand quickly, doing that purely through internal funding can take time. It can also come up when firms are trying to align non-lawyer leadership differently, particularly when operational roles are becoming more critical and the traditional ownership model doesn't support that. But even then, it's not a default decision. It introduces trade-offs around control and incentives and how decisions are made. So the better question isn't should we take outside investment? It's what are we trying to achieve and what structure supports that best? So the issue isn't that firms can't build capabilities and efficiency. Obviously, we have, and we will continue to. The issue is whether that can be sustained over time within the current partnership structure. And these constraints are things that firms deal with every day. When capital is tied to annual distributions, long-term reinvestment becomes difficult. When ownership is limited to lawyers, you're limited in ways to incentivize professional management. When operations are treated as cost center investments, they compete with partner income and are measured on cost, not outcomes. And when law and business operations are tightly intertwined, it creates tension between autonomy and efficiency. Now, none of that means firms can't improve. They can, and they do, but it's hard to do these consistently over time. When you introduce a different structure, capital can be retained and deployed over years. Non-lawyer leadership can be aligned through ownership and incentives. Operations can be managed as a business with accountability for performance. And there's a clear separation between practicing law and running the business. So the point here is not that these capabilities are impossible inside a firm. It's that they're difficult to sustain within the traditional structure. And that's the distinction that matters. So at this point, it isn't really about MSOs as a concept. It's about whether your current structure is holding up under the demands you're placing on it. Where are you constrained today? Not theoretically, but in how work is actually getting done. What are you continuing to build internally that doesn't differentiate you? Where are you inconsistent? Billing, collections, technology decisions, areas where performance should be predictable but isn't. And then the harder question, how are you funding the level of investment the business requires now? You don't need to decide on a model immediately, but you do need to be honest about whether your current one is still sufficient. Thank you so much. I am happy to take any questions that you might have. I am very enthusiastic about this topic. So,
Any questions? Stacey, I have a question for you. So if many firms may be hearing about MSOs for the first time, what is
mhm.
the first step they should take if they want to learn more or kind of move their business to that model?
So a lot of it has to do with kind of doing an internal audit around your functions. So what is it? Where are you having a hard time staying ahead of the game, where you want to invest but can't because of whatever restrictions? Where are the areas where, and where we see this come up a lot is around technology improvements. Where are you just struggling to implement new technology? I successfully gave this whole presentation without talking about AI, but you got that is, of course, where we see a lot of interest, and the firms just don't have the internal capability to do it. So the ability to access external, not just external funding, but external resources that can help build that functionality and help implement that within the firm is where we see a lot of activity. So a lot of it is around doing some soul searching, doing some internal diagnostics around where your opportunities for improvement are and what the plan is to address them.
Awesome. We have a question from Kathleen. How does the MSO change the firm? Are all W-2s and 1099s work for the MSO?
Again, this is not a one size fits all. So where we're seeing a lot of activity is around those functions that are relatively far removed from the practice of law. So finance, IT, HR, where they're not touching client data, and migrating those into an MSO and establishing a different management structure there so that they are now a service provider, a vendor to the firm providing those services. And really, the focus for the firm is on the practice of law, and then they're receiving a level of service. What that requires is really getting specific and establishing service level agreements, which a lot of firms don't have internally right now. So it's a good exercise no matter what. Like, what's your billing edit turnaround time? How quickly do you onboard a new employee? Things like that. So that you can be very clear on what services the MSO is providing to the law firm, but it's not an ever an all or nothing solution. What we saw at Ramon was that all of the employees, all of the W-2, all of the non-lawyers, including paralegals, were moved into a back office. And there are some pros and cons to that method as well. And that's a bit more aggressive, I think, than most firms are willing to take on. And it depends on whether or not you're doing this with a private equity partner. The private equity will want to move more into that MSO, but that's not necessarily the best fit for the firm.
Okay, thank you. And then, sorry, clarification from Kathleen. How does the MSO charge the firm? Like, how does the MSO make money from the firm?
Yeah, again, it's there's not a one size fits all. There's a lot of work being done around transfer pricing for those things, but at the end of the day, the easiest way to think about it is the MSO is now a vendor to the firm. So like any other vendor, you negotiate that pricing on what seems fair to the firm and still allows the MSO enough funds to operate and improve.
Okay. Question from Veronica. How should firms think about number one, staffing for an MSO model, and number two, selling the MSO as an offering to other firms slash clients?
Well, before you can sell to other firms slash clients, you really have to get that, you have to establish your business model. which if you're coming from a firm, then you have the opportunity to do that from the get-go. And then being able to market those services to other firms. It becomes, in some ways, a merger without a merger. That's some of the terminology that we use within Federate as well, in that it eliminates some of the conflict associated with the merger, but you get some of the economies of scale if you manage it appropriately. The the structure doesn't necessarily have to be materially different from what is currently existing in the firm, but I would recommend a roadmap to what kind of your ideal state is. And we can really look to other industries on what those organizational structures can look like. If you look at accounting firms or doctor's offices or things like that that already have experienced with the MSO models, we can get a better idea of kind of what those MSO organizational structures can look like. But this is an opportunity for us to, stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from the people that came before us and maybe not make some of the same mistakes that we've seen in other industries.
Awesome. Are there any tax benefit?
There can be. Of course, taxes are super complicated, but there absolutely can be tax benefits because depending on the structure of how you structure the MSO as opposed to the partnership, you can balance things differently so that you're taking advantage of the things that are that are beneficial under a partnership structure, but then moving the things that are beneficial under, say, a corporate structure into the MSO. So it creates some opportunities, but that requires tax counsel, and I am not that. So that it can be a very complicated topic.
Thank you. Any more questions? Um, Question for me, if folks that are here, if they can remember one thing from today's discussion, what would you say that would be, Stacey? Like the key takeaway.
Key takeaway is MSO and private equity are not the same thing. And MSO can offer a lot of opportunities for improvement for a law firm, even if they're not interested in outside investment. One of my concerns is that when people hear MSO, they think outside investment, and that's not necessarily the same. Your MSO can be wholly owned by your partnership and no change in ownership if that's what the firm chooses.
Yeah. And how do you see this MSO model going over the next 3 to 5 years based on the trends you're seeing now?
I think we will get to a place where every firm has an MSO. Whether they are sharing it with other firms or whether it is a single fully dedicated one, I think that it's too powerful a tool for firms not to leverage it. It's going to take a little while for us to really establish what success looks like there, and I think that we're going to have some mistakes along the way. But I think that in the long run, there's too much pro for the
Hmm.
firms for us not to take advantage of this model.
Okay. What size firms are you seeing the most success with?
I think we're getting the most traction in like large mid-sized to like the second AmLaw the second 100 AmLaw list. Not the largest of the large firms are in kind of a different playing field. They're approaching things a bit differently. And for small firms, for very small firms, it doesn't necessarily make sense to set up or to have their own MSO, though we'll see more aggregation there and more use of shared MSOs. But where we're seeing them is firms that are somewhere between like 30 attorneys and 200 attorneys, where they are reaping the most benefit from and the ability to scale and compete on a level that they weren't before by leveraging this model. And they are the ones that seem most nimble and interested in taking advantage of it right now.
How hard is the implementation if you were to switch?
Depends on the firm. It depends on the scope. So if you're really just focusing on the pure administrative functions, finance, IT, HR, it doesn't have to be particularly difficult. No more difficult than a financial system implementation. How about that?
Yeah.
But it's not a small undertaking either. I mean, it is a fundamental shift in how things are happening. But yeah, I'd put it about on par as a financial system
Yeah.
implementation. A little bit easier than that.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Are there any more questions before we wrap up? All right. Thank you, Stacey. Appreciate it. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time. And just so everybody knows, we're going to send out the recording and the slides to everybody that attended it or could not attend so that you'll have it handy. And again, Stacey, thank you so much for your time and
Thank you.
appreciate you all. Bye.